I'm Mr. Black, and this is Beyond Creepy. What would you do if you could step onto a spacecraft and ask the occupants any question you wanted? For a man in Russia, this scenario became a reality. This is the strange case of Oleg Chernikov. It was November 2nd, 1989, Russia. Two truck drivers, Oleg Kirzhakov and his companion, Nikolai Barenkov, were driving their transport near the area of Arkhangelsk, heading toward Moscow. It was night and the air temperature had dropped below zero. Both men were in a rush to return home. They were eager to complete the formalities related to their business trip before their planned holidays. In the vicinity of the Emsa railroad station, piles of sand and gravel blocked the road. Apparently it was under repairs, so Oleg, behind the wheel, elected to drive down a dirt road to detour around. On one bend in the road, the truck's headlights fell upon a huge structure, which was standing off to the right side of the road. Oleg initially assumed that it was some equipment for the road repair work. There were many machines there because the road was under construction. However, when I drove closer, I saw a big object that in the headlights had a metallic sheen to it. When we got to within 80 to 90 feet of the object, our motor stalled, and our truck coasted several feet further and stopped. Curiously, Oleg noticed that the headlights that were connected to the backup power source were still on. Oleg and his partner were confused on what might have caused the sudden failure. As mentioned, the road had a bend in it and some trees partially obstructed their view of the object. That said, both men understood that what they were looking at was, quote, unusual, and both sensed that something was going to happen, and neither had the power to stop it. After sitting for a few minutes, Oleg nervously asked Nikolai to remain in the truck and keep an eye on him, as he was going to approach the object. His sole intention was to examine it and find out what it was. He slowly climbed out and began to make his way over. After he had passed the hood of the truck, he began to feel, with each step he took, an increased resistance from the air. His body seemed to, quote, melt, and it became difficult for him to move. Oleg understood that something related to the object was causing this, and he knew that if he were to get any closer to it, he would not be able to move at all. Oleg thought it best to turn back. He still wanted to get close to the object and thought he might be able to do it from another direction. He moved carefully, stopping after each step. He felt the same, constantly increasing resistance from the air no matter which direction he walked. He eventually succeeded in coming to within about 30 to 36 feet of the object. He stopped on the shoulder of the road and stood there examining it very carefully. It was very unusual, he noted. He quickly surmised that the object was not normal, that it most likely was not from this planet. He described that it was a huge disc-shaped object, approximately 120 to 140 feet in diameter, with a dome-shaped top, on which no other structures were visible. Along the perimeter of the disc, there were some dark holes evident. Oleg initially took these to be portholes, but wasn't sure. Extending from the lower part of the object, there were two structures or legs visible, which seemed to support the ship. The far edge of the disc was slightly elevated and was resting on some birch trees, two of which were broken. The object looked dark and uninhabited, and there were no traces visible of windows, doors, or hatches. Oleg began to wonder if maybe something had caused the craft to land there, like maybe something had broken down and they, or whoever was inside it, were in need of assistance. Oleg stood pondering, wondering what he should do next. Maybe he could offer to help them, he thought. At that very moment, in front of him, at a distance of an outstretched hand, right in the air, appeared a glimmering red dotted line. This line formed a transparent square-shaped screen, 150 millimeters by 150 millimeters in size, with rounded corners. Written in red letters, several words appeared on the screen. Oleg did not remember the exact phrase, but the essence of the message was that they wanted, quote, burning fire. Oleg then realized that the screen he was looking at was being projected on the body of the object. He mechanically turned back to look at Nikolai, who was still sitting in the cab of the truck looking out at him. Once again, Oleg observed the screen, but this time it appeared to be standing in front of the truck. He attempted to look from one side to the other, but no matter where he turned his eyes, the screen remained in front of his eyes. The distance to the screen remained constant, and he reached out his hand to try and touch it. The screen remained in front of Oleg for the duration of the contact. However, the inscriptions which appeared on the screen remained only as long as was necessary for him to understand each one. Only then was the last inscription replaced by a new one. These beings seem very accommodating. Most of the cases, they just speak to them in their mind. Well, these guys actually went the next step and provided him with a VR chalkboard. So that's interesting. After Oleg understood what was being requested of him, he carefully backed away from the object, began heading back to the truck, all the while still experiencing the same resistance. He returned to the truck and attempted to open the right door of the cab in order to obtain some kitchen matches. Despite the combined efforts of both Oleg and Nikolai, they were not able to open the door for a considerable length of time, as if some force was keeping it closed. Eventually it let up and they were able to open it quite easily. Nikolai asked Oleg why he was moving his hands like that. Why was he reaching for nothing? Oleg then began to understand that the screen he saw was only visible to him. Somehow the messages were being projected in front of his eyes, though nobody else was allowed to see them. Oleg brushed it off. He removed the box of matches from the truck's cabin, together with a bottle of laboratory alcohol, which was used as antifreeze in the braking system. Again, he asked Nikolai, who was understandably confused, to stay inside the truck. Oleg returned to the same place on the shoulder of the road where he had stood before. However, this time he was able to move more easily, and he experienced none of the resistance he had encountered previously. He looked around for the material to make fire. He grabbed some dry leaves by the road and gathered them into a pile. He poured the alcohol onto the leaves and ignited them with the match. Upon lifting his head, he observed that a passage appeared on the surface of the object, which extended into the interior, forming a corridor. At the distant end of this corridor, he could see a glimmering bluish light. At first, Oleg had the impression that a shadow was moving inside the corridor. He then realized that something was moving in the corridor, and it was heading right toward the opening. When he finally clued into what was happening, he became frightened. He began stepping backward and fell into the ditch along the side of the road. He immediately rose to his feet and, still standing in the ditch, continued to observe the corridor, fearing that something was going to come out. A something did indeed approach the opening. To Oleg, it appeared to be a dark mass, which reminded him of a black garbage bag or sack. As the mass moved, it swayed from bent side to side, and its periphery was vague in appearance. At this moment, a shaft extended from the object. It bent, and it descended to the surface of the ground. The mass slid down the shaft, and while increasing in size, approached the hastily constructed pile of burning leaves. Oleg was completely paralyzed with fear. The mass stood by the fire for a brief moment, and then returned to the object, taking with it the box of matches which Oleg had earlier placed on the ground. It moved along the same path which it moved when it left the object, and disappeared inside the corridor, still holding the box of matches. Only after it was out of sight was Oleg able to move again. He climbed out of the ditch and looked back at the truck. The truck's headlights momentarily blinded him, but nevertheless he could see the frightened face of Nikolai, which was pressed against the windshield. For a long time Oleg remained standing on the road, and was unable to recover his senses. He felt strange. In that moment, Oleg seemed to come to terms with the situation that he had found himself in. This was an extraordinary event, and he was a part of it. He knew that he would most likely never experience something like this again, and despite his own trepidation, he was not in a hurry to get back to the truck. He wanted to know what was going to happen next. He waited on the road watching the craft. After some time, he thought about getting closer to examine it close up. Suddenly, a message appeared on the screen. It was an invitation to enter the ship. After a short pause, Oleg decided to approach the object. The first thing that caught his attention were the several round openings, approximately 300 millimeters in diameter, which he initially assumed were portholes. Inside these openings, at a depth of 300 to 350 millimeters, a grid of intersecting lines, light gray in color, were visible. The central axis of the openings was displaced approximately 30 degrees from the plane formed by the surface of the object. Oleg was able to determine one of the support legs that the object rested on. The leg consisted of two parts which were connected at an articulating joint. The cross-section of each of the two parts of the leg was in the profile of a three-sided channel beam, with the lower part being smaller in diameter, such that it could be folded inside the upper portion. On the bottom of the ship, recessed areas were clearly visible, into which the legs could be retracted. However, because of the poor lighting, the area where the leg was located, Oleg was not able to examine in detail the actual construction of the leg. The far side of the object was resting on some trees and was slanted toward Oleg, such that the lower portion of the opening was just above the level of his head. He wanted to figure out what the object was made of, so he reached up and grabbed a round, smooth tube with a diameter of approximately 50 millimeters, which was protruding out from the craft. He noted that it was cold and felt metallic. He suddenly had a desire to go inside. Since the door was above his head, he decided to use the tube to pull himself up and into the opening. The moment his hand grabbed the tube, he instantly found himself standing just inside the opening. He had not climbed up, and there were nothing there in the form of either steps or elevator to use. He was just there, as if the very thought itself had placed him there. Curiously, he did not feel any kind of external influence or manipulation, but rather everything seemed to happen naturally or by itself. Peering inside, Oleg sensed that it might be dangerous and decided to be as careful as possible. At that very instant, he received a message on the screen that he had nothing to be afraid of and that he could enter. Upon stepping inside the corridor, he looked at the walls and noticed the absence of doors. The corridor was significantly wider than the opening, the floor was flat, and the walls and ceiling formed an oval. He went along the corridor for approximately 20 to 25 feet. At the end of the corridor, he saw that it entered a large hall with a diameter of approximately 60 feet. On the periphery of the wall, there were 5 other entrances, similar in appearance to the one which he had just entered. The ceiling in the hall was domed, and it was emitting a soft, diffused blue light. Between the other entrances and along the walls, there were panels of flashing lights. Each panel appeared to consist of 5 to 6 vertical elements. To the left of the entrance through which Oleg had entered, 2 walls had no panels. In the place of panels, there were horizontal recesses in the walls, which were dark-colored. Also, to the left, he observed 2 dark, vague spots that looked like black bags. They were just there, and he wasn't sure what to make of them. And then they started to move in his direction. These bags were identical to the mass which he had seen near the fire. Oleg stopped and stood motionless at the entrance to the hall. As soon as he looked around the hall, certain questions came to him, the answers to which appeared immediately on the screen. But then he noticed that the answers appeared in his head before he was able to read them on the screen. Several answers were accompanied by demonstrations of the operation of those devices that interested him. In such a manner, his question of the significance of the dark horizontal recess in the wall off to his left was demonstrated to him. The recess was a 3-dimensional screen on which he was shown the interior of another sister ship with the same moving masses. During the demonstration, the 2 masses in their ship were motionless. Then they showed a craft in space among the stars, and at the very end of the demonstration they showed the speaker of a Soviet television program called Vremya. Off to his right side there was an oval control panel or desk located about 5 feet from the wall, on which there were many switches and lamps. All of the lamps had a flat square shape, and from all appearances they appeared to be movable. Some of them were elevated above the level of the control panel, and others were flush with the top of the panel. On the upper surface of the lamps there were some symbols in the form of geometric figures, e.g. circles, triangles, quadrilateral figures, lines, etc., and combinations of such. The black switches on the panel were similar in appearance to toggle switches. The control panel was completely devoid of meters and scales. In addition, Oleg described a long straight divan which stood next to the control panel, and a circular crack in the floor which surrounded the central part of the hall. The crack gave him reason to believe that the central part of the floor was rotatable, which allowed the control panel to be positioned in front of any of the vertical panels which were situated along the walls. On the vertical panels, Oleg noticed the same types of lamps that were on the control panel. Many of the lamps were flashing. The entire interior of the hall was white in color, including the floor, and only from the ceiling shone soft blue light. Looking upward, Oleg tried to locate the source of the light, while simultaneously asking about the nature of the light. No answer to his question appeared on the screen. Then, in response to his question, "Who are you and where are you from?" the dome in the hall slowly started to dim, and like in a planetarium, a star map appeared on the ceiling. While Oleg was trying to find some familiar star system, one of the stars suddenly began to pulsate and began to descend slowly. The dark, almost black starlit sky, combined with the pulsating star, suspended over Oleg's head, as well with the flashing lamps at the control and vertical panels, emitted enough light to permit him to see all the elements in the entire interior of the spacecraft. In a minute, the pulsating star slowly rose, and the dome re-illuminated with the diffuse blue light. Oleg was unable to carefully study and remember the star map shown to him. He asked where this pulsating star was located. They answered, "This is in your galaxy." He asked question after question. The answers he received were in his head before he saw them on the screen. He asked what kind of ship he was on now, what kind of propulsion system did they use to make it fly. In response, he was told that this spacecraft was a scout ship and used electromagnetic fields to fly. He was also told that they are studying our planet, which they needed as a springboard to the future. In response to his question, "Do you have any connection with Bigfoot?" they said yes, and added that they surveil the Bigfoot population on the planet continuously. If I was ever taken by beings and I had a chance to speak to them, one of the questions I would probably ask them is if they were connected to the Bigfoot phenomenon, and this guy actually did, and their answer was that yes, that they kept an eye on them. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are one and the same. It just sounds like these things exist and that these beings are aware of them and keeping an eye on them or studying them. As he was asking question after question, he suddenly noticed that a third mass had appeared in the hall, and then a fourth. He watched a conversation take place between them and came to the understanding that he was going to have to leave. His next thought was to leave something with them for a memory. He took off his watch and wanted to put it on the floor, but at this moment he was told that they had a complete knowledge of the Earth and needed nothing. For the first time during his visit, they asked him a question. "Why do you use a watch made in another country?" Oleg answered, though his response regarding the matter was not relayed in the report. Oleg then asked if it was possible to see them again. "If you will be in danger, we will find you within 15 seconds, they told him. Backing up a few steps from the hall, he turned and went along the corridor towards the opening. As he came up to the opening of the spacecraft, he took a hold of the tube by his right hand, and he immediately found himself standing on the ground. Not looking back, he went to the ditch and crossed over to the road, to the same place where he had stood a few moments before. When he looked back, he noticed that the tube and the opening had disappeared. In a few seconds, he saw the outer rim begin to move in a clockwise direction. The dome began to move in approximately 30 seconds in a counterclockwise direction, and around it began to appear a luminescence surrounding the spacecraft. As the revolutions became faster, the luminescence enveloped the craft, and it soon became nothing but a ball of light. Oleg noticed that the rotation of all the parts of the craft and the luminescence was happening in absolute silence. At this moment, he saw on the road 2 more cars with their headlights on. Were they the reason his visit with the beings was cut short, he wondered? For a few seconds, this distracted his attention from the craft. The sound of the trees cracking made him turn and look at the object. The ball of light slightly shifted position and slowly began to rise. Then abruptly accelerating, it shot out of sight towards the northeast. His friend Nikolai got out of the truck and, together with the occupants from the other vehicles, came up to Oleg. They asked him a lot of questions. Oleg was impressed by the experience and at the same time was too shaken to speak, and fully realized all that had just happened. His hands and legs were trembling. When he got into his truck, he was unable to press the accelerator or shift the gears. He had to let his partner drive. Oleg would eventually tell his story to researchers Eugene Chernikov and Valery Uvarov. They said that they're using Earth as a springboard to their future. I don't know what that means. Are they studying us to better themselves? Is there something on Earth that they need to continue their species? I don't know. Are they planning something? Like, is it sinister? Maybe that they had planned to, I don't know, at some point cultivate the Earth when we're long gone. I don't know. It's open to interpretation. I don't know what they meant by that.